Behind every great Oscar lies a medical file that was quietly buried in the archives of psychiatric hospitals. I will lead you through corridors of madness where yesterday's demigods were turned into laboratory animals, stripped of memory, identity, and sometimes life itself under the watchful eyes of executioners in white coats. These 10 stars of classic cinema proved one thing. In Hollywood, common sense is the rarest commodity, and the shortest path from the stage leads straight to solitary confinement. If you have the courage to watch this nightmare to the end, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to write in the comments, was worldwide fame worth such a monstrous price?
Marilyn Monroe. When we think of Marilyn Monroe, we picture her laughing over a subway grate or singing Happy Birthday to the President. Few people know that behind the scenes of that dazzling life lurked a true horror, one that reached its peak in February 1961. While the tabloids loudly announced yet another rest cure following her painful divorce from playwright Arthur Miller, the planet's greatest icon was being methodically destroyed behind the locked doors of the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic. This was not voluntary treatment. It was a calculated operation to isolate a woman who had become too inconvenient and too emotionally unstable for the Hollywood machine. The most terrifying part of this story is that the betrayal came from the person Marilyn trusted with her deepest fears, her personal psychoanalyst, Dr. Marianne Criss. Hiding behind the mask of concern, this woman convinced Monroe that she needed to check into a hospital under the false name Faye Miller, just to get herself together for a while. But the moment the heavy doors of the clinic slammed shut behind her, the fairy tale of peace turned into a waking nightmare. Instead of a private room overlooking a park and courteous staff, the sex symbol of a generation found herself in an actual isolation cell meant for violent patients. Imagine the state of a woman whose image was synonymous with luxury. She was forced into a coarse hospital gown, stripped of all personal belongings, and locked in a room with cold concrete block walls and windows concealed behind heavy curtains and massive steel bars. The psychological pressure began immediately. Monroe was forbidden to call anyone, cut off from the outside world, treated not as a global star, but as a number in a ledger. The doctors and orderlies displayed staggering cynicism. When Marilyn, in tears, begged to be released, explaining that she had been admitted by mistake, she was met with icy replies that her behavior only confirmed the diagnosis. One doctor delivered a line that burned itself into her memory forever. "You'd have to be truly insane to enjoy it here. Since you're complaining, this is exactly where you belong." It was classic gaslighting, designed to crush a person's will. In letters from the clinic that later became public, Monroe described inhuman conditions. She felt like a criminal imprisoned for sins she had never committed. It seemed to her that her brain was being rewired with drugs that left her feeling like a vegetable. Dr. Criss, who had promised support, simply vanished, leaving Marilyn alone with a system built to suppress personality, not heal it. The actress began to lose her grip on reality. She would sit on the floor for hours staring at nothing, and that was precisely the result the doctors wanted, the complete erosion of her sense of self. The bitter irony was that her psyche had been shattered by Hollywood itself, the endless demands of Fox Studios, the relentless pursuit of paparazzi. Payne Whitney was merely the final nail in the coffin of her mental balance. She stood on the edge of real madness when she realized that none of her so-called friends in the film industry intended to save her. The only person who dared to challenge the system was her former husband, Joe DiMaggio. When he learned of the conditions in which Marilyn was being held, he stormed into the clinic and caused a massive scene, threatening to tear the place apart brick by brick if his ex-wife was not released immediately. Under his pressure, the doctors finally relented and opened the cell door. Marilyn emerged a different person. Her eyes were dimmed, and her fear of doctors had turned into paranoia. She never forgave Dr. Chris for that betrayal, having realized that in the world of screen gods, psychotherapy was just another tool of control and manipulation. Solitary confinement killed her faith in people forever. She left Payne Whitney carrying a trauma so deep that a little over a year later it would lead her to that fateful night. This was the first time the world saw the truth. Hollywood was ready to lock up its greatest icon behind bars and label her insane the moment she stopped being a perfect doll. Marilyn Monroe's cell became a symbol of what hides behind the glitter of fame. Concrete walls, steel bars, and the chilling realization that the people closest to you can turn into your executioners in white coats. She was the blonde for all time, but in February of '51, she was simply a broken woman who understood that there was no exit from the asylum Hollywood had turned her life into.
Vivien Leigh. If the history of cinema has ever known an actress who quite literally burned up in the glare of her own talent, it was, without question, Vivien Leigh. Her beauty was so flawless it seemed like a divine gift. Yet behind that radiant facade lived a mind consumed by the destructive fire of bipolar disorder. While the world stood in awe of her Scarlett O'Hara, Vivien herself was fighting an exhausting private war with the black dog of depression and violent surges of uncontrollable mania that reduced her life to chaos. Hollywood is a place that adores drama on screen, but is utterly incapable of compassion for real psychological pain, and Leigh's story became one of its most brutal proofs. The turning point in her downfall was the role of Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire. Vivien, a devoted practitioner of total immersion, allowed the image of this fragile, fading Southern woman to enter her so deeply that the boundary between reality and fiction dissolved completely. Years later, she admitted with frightening honesty, "For 9 months, I was Blanche Dubois, and in the end, she took possession of me. She knocked the ground out from under my feet and pushed me into the abyss of madness." This was not an actor's flirtation with drama. It was a cry for help from someone who felt her own identity splintering apart. In those years, mental illness in Hollywood was spoken of only in whispers, and Vivien's behavior was dismissed as a vicious temperament or starry whims. Colleagues recalled that working with her was like walking through a minefield. One moment she embodied impeccable British aristocracy, the next she transformed into a fury, spewing curses and insults. Her husband, the great Laurence Olivier, became the chief witness to and victim of this madness. At home, Vivien could spend hours in hysterics, accusing him of every mortal sin, smashing furniture, tearing at her own clothes, only to wake the next morning with an utterly blank face, remembering nothing of the night's nightmare. Olivier, worn down by this endless struggle, gradually began to pull away, which only poured fuel on the fire of her paranoia. The crisis reached its peak in 1953 on the set of Elephant Walk in Ceylon. The heat, the humidity, and years of accumulated exhaustion led to a complete psychological collapse. Vivien began to suffer hallucinations, failed to recognize her fellow actors, and drifted into delirium, delivering lines from A Streetcar Named Desire instead of the current script. Paramount, unwilling to lose money, acted with ruthless efficiency. Leigh was abruptly removed from the film, replaced by Elizabeth Taylor, and sent under near guard to a psychiatric clinic. And here begins the darkest chapter of her life: treatment. Mid-century medicine was merciless. The primary method of subduing difficult actresses was electroconvulsive therapy. Vivien Leigh endured dozens of electric shock sessions. Imagine it, one of the most beautiful and gifted women in the world, strapped to a table, a gag forced into her mouth, electrical currents sent through her brain until her body arched in violent convulsions. Doctors believed this would reboot her mind, but in reality it only scorched it, erasing memories and destroying the delicate emotional sensitivity that made her extraordinary. After leaving the clinic, red marks from electrodes were often visible on her forehead, which she tried to conceal beneath makeup. She returned to the stage and the screen, but this was no longer the Vivien she had been. Her eyes grew hollow, her movements mechanical. To those around her, she remained a goddess, but she knew that a monster lived inside her, one that would eventually take everything. Hollywood continued to exploit her image until she finally broke beyond repair. Her bipolar disorder, compounded by tuberculosis, turned the last years of her life into a prolonged agony. Vivien Leigh died at the age of 53, universally celebrated, yet endlessly alone in her madness. She was a woman who gave her soul to art, and when art demanded her mind in return, the industry simply watched from a safe distance, counting box office receipts. The tragedy of Vivien Leigh stands as an eternal reminder that behind an Oscar speech there is often the sound of a psychiatric ward door slamming shut, and that the price of genius can be higher than life itself. She became a victim of her own gift and of a system that preferred to treat symptoms with electricity rather than attempt to understand the wounded soul of a great artist.
Frances Farmer. If Marilyn Monroe's story is a drama and Vivien Leigh's a tragedy, then the life of Frances Farmer is pure horror, one that chills the blood even of the most cynical inhabitants of the Dream Factory. Frances was an anomaly for her era, too intelligent, too politically outspoken, too brutally honest. She openly despised Hollywood glitter, called studio bosses flesh merchants, and refused to play the part of a brainless doll with painted-on eyebrows. The system does not forgive that kind of defiance, and the punishment was meant to be exemplary. It began with a series of minor clashes with the law, drunk driving, an altercation with a police officer to whose face she bluntly expressed her opinion of his intelligence. Under normal circumstances, it would have ended with a fine or community service, but Hollywood chose a far more terrifying weapon: psychiatry. In 1943, she was literally dragged barefoot out of a hotel and hauled into a courtroom where a judge, conveniently aligned with studio interests, declared her unstable. That verdict marked the start of her long descent into hell. The final blow came from the person who should have protected her. Her mother, Lillian Farmer, became the willing executioner of her own daughter, signing papers that transferred Frances into state custody, effectively a death sentence for her personality. Farmer was sent to Steilacoom State Hospital in Washington, a place that even by the standards of the time was considered a dumping ground for the unwanted. The conditions were beyond brutal: overcrowded wards, filth, vermin, and orderlies who saw in the former film star nothing more than a disposable body. Frances endured every circle of psychiatric hell available at the time. She was held for hours in ice-cold baths until she lost consciousness. She was subjected to electroshock treatments without anesthesia, procedures that ravaged her mind rather than healed it. Yet the darkest horrors remained hidden in the shadows of the hospital corridors. According to multiple accounts and Frances's own later testimony, she was systematically abused, stripped of all dignity and protection. The woman who once shone on movie screens was reduced to a voiceless object inside the locked wards of an institution that existed beyond accountability. Even that was not enough for Hollywood. To silence the rebel for good, a celebrated figure entered the scene: Dr. Walter Freeman,
the infamous surgeon who toured the country with his traveling practice of lobotomy. He championed transorbital lobotomy, a procedure that today inspires nothing but dread. Without Francis's consent, Freeman drove a steel instrument through the eye socket, breaching the thin bone of the skull to sever connections in the frontal lobes and calm the defiant woman. It was the surgical castration of the soul. Frances Farmer, who once quoted Nietzsche and dreamed of meaningful roles, was transformed into a docile, empty-eyed shell. When she was finally released, she was a shadow of her former self. Hollywood watched with a detached curiosity as she struggled to exist, sorting mail at the post office, hosting a small, forgettable television show where all that was required of her was to smile and remain silent. Her former fire had not merely gone out, it had been cut away with surgical precision. She died at 56 from cancer, but the truth is that Frances Farmer was killed decades earlier, at the moment Freeman's hammer destroyed her ability to feel and to resist. Her story stands as a grim monument to what happens to those who dare to say no to the dream industry. Hollywood did not simply discard her. With the hands of doctors and the silent consent of the public, it systematically turned one of the brightest women of her generation into a living corpse, so that no one else would dare rise against the system. It was a lesson delivered with brutal clarity. In a world that sells smiles, the price of truth is often a piece of your own mind.
Jean Tierney. If there was a woman in Hollywood's golden age whose face could silence even the loudest crowd, it was Jean Tierney. Sharp cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, and that unmistakable aristocratic distance that made her the untouchable Laura in the eyes of millions. Yet her fate stands as a brutal reminder that even divine beauty offers no immunity from human cruelty or mental hell. Jean's tragedy did not begin in a psychiatrist's office, but at a meeting with a fan whose boundless selfishness became a death sentence for the actress's happiness. While pregnant with her first child, Jean attended an event for servicemen. One admirer, violating a quarantine for rubella, decided to approach and greet the star anyway. The consequences were catastrophic. Jean's daughter, Daria, was born almost blind, deaf, and with severe intellectual disabilities. The most devastating moment came later, when that same fan encountered Tierney again 2 years afterward and proudly confessed, "I was sick back then, but I wanted to see you so badly that I came anyway." Something inside Jean broke beyond repair at that instant. The realization that her child's life had been sacrificed to the passing whim of a stranger plunged the actress into a profound depression. Hollywood, which demanded perfection from her, turned into a torture chamber. She began forgetting her lines, freezing in front of the camera, and her famous gaze filled with such unbearable sorrow that makeup artists were powerless to conceal it. By the mid-1950s, Jean Tierney had become a ghost of herself. She started hearing voices and suffering from hallucinations, and eventually her family was forced to send her to the Institute of Living in Hartford. And here, treatment turned into a methodical execution. At the time, psychiatrists believed the brain was a faulty electrical device that needed to be rebooted with a powerful surge of current. Jean Tierney was subjected to 27 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy. Imagine it, a woman whose face was a national treasure, strapped to a table, electricity driven through her head again and again with such force that her muscles clenched until bones cracked. Later, Jean recalled bitterly that these sessions did not heal her, but effectively stole her identity. The current erased layers of her memory, destroyed recollections of her roles and of the people she loved, turning her past into white noise. Each procedure was an act of violence against her mind, carried out under the guise of medical care. The peak of her despair came in 1957. Jean was found standing on the ledge of the 14th floor of her mother's apartment building. She remained there for 20 minutes, staring at the city that had once worshipped her, seriously considering taking the final step into the void. This was not a star's whim, but the end point of exhaustion of a person whose mind had been scorched by electricity. She was pulled back from that ledge, but the road back was agonizing. The most beautiful woman in the world, having passed through the circles of psychiatric hell, voluntarily took a job as a sales clerk in a small clothing store. She wanted simple human contact, a place where she would not be judged for a diagnosis or forgotten lines. She tried to return to cinema, but Hollywood is a place for winners, not survivors. The industry nodded sympathetically, yet the roles went to others. Jean Tierney lived a long life, but she remained forever disabled on this invisible front, where the enemy hid inside her own head, and the allies in white coats struck with electric shocks at what was most precious, her memory. Her story is a grim monument to the selfishness of the crowd and the cruelty of early psychiatry, which treated the soul by breaking the body and erasing a human being like an unwanted recording on film.
Clara Bow. If you were looking for the moment when Hollywood first recognized the power of female magnetism, you will inevitably arrive at the name Clara Bow. She was the first official it girl, a woman who possessed that elusive something that made millions of men lose their heads and sent women rushing to buy lipstick in shades called Heartbeat. Yet behind the whirlwind of energy, cropped hair, and carefree laughter lay an abyss Clara tried to fill with Hollywood glitter and never could. Her life was wired to explode from the very beginning, back in the Brooklyn slums where a happy childhood was a concept from another universe. Clara's mother, Sarah, suffered from severe mental illness brought on by a head injury and deepened by relentless poverty. The most terrifying memory Clara carried with her all her life, the one that became the foundation of her future schizophrenia, came on a freezing night in her childhood. She woke to the cold touch of steel at her throat. Her own mother stood over her, clutching a kitchen knife in a fit of madness, fully convinced she had to kill her daughter to save her from the world. After that, her mother was locked away in an institution where she eventually died. Clara, meanwhile, remained forever that frightened child, waiting for a blow from the person closest to her. When Bow burst into cinema, her explosive energy was not merely talent, it was sublimated fear. She worked like a machine, filming dozens of movies a year, lived a frantic personal life, changed lovers with reckless ease, and spent money as if tomorrow were not guaranteed. By the early 1930s, when sound films arrived along with new demands and pressures, the fragile machinery of her mind began to fail. Clara developed severe insomnia, panic attacks, and hallucinations. She felt the walls of her luxurious mansion whispering about her sins, shadows from her Brooklyn past lurking in every corner. Hollywood, which had carried her in its arms yesterday, instantly smelled weakness. Studios grew weary of her instability, and the press unleashed a merciless campaign, accusing her of every imaginable vice and scandal. In 1931, Clara suffered a devastating nervous breakdown and effectively fled the industry. She married actor Rex Bell and retreated to a remote ranch in Nevada, hoping the silence of the desert would heal her. It did not. After the birth of her two sons, her condition sharply worsened. Paranoia set in. She suspected her husband of betrayal and conspiracies, her behavior becoming increasingly erratic and alarming. In 1949, at just 44 years old, Clara voluntarily entered a psychiatric hospital known as the Institute of Living. There she received the final, merciless diagnosis: schizophrenia. It was the end of the legend. Doctors subjected her to endless tests and experimental treatments, attempting to fix what had been broken in childhood. The remaining decades of her life were spent in voluntary exile. Once the most desired woman in the world, she lived quietly in a modest cottage in Culver City, rarely leaving the house and avoiding the press. Her only companions was a television set and nurses. Clara Bow became a living ghost of Hollywood.
while the screen replayed retrospectives of her films, where she was forever young, daring, and flirtatious. The real Clara sat in the dark, startled by every sound, battling voices in her head that never fell silent. She was a victim of an industry that drained her vitality and heredity that gave her no chance at normalcy. The cruel irony of her life was that she taught the world how to enjoy living, while her own existence was soaked in fear rooted in the image of her mother's knife, which in her mind never truly left her throat. Clara Bow died of a heart attack in 1965, watching an old Western on television, forgotten by almost everyone and infinitely distant from the radiant it-girl image she once gave the world. She was the first to reveal that behind the mask of perfect allure can hide a shattered mind, and that Hollywood is, in the end, just a ward with very expensive, very soft walls.
Veronica Lake. If Hollywood in the 1940s had a face veiled in mystery, it was the face of Veronica Lake. Her famous peekaboo hairstyle, a cascade of golden hair falling fatally over one eye, became more than a fashion trend. It was a national obsession. The U.S. government was even forced to ask the actress to change her look because women working in defense factories, copying her style, were getting their hair caught in machinery and seriously injured. Yet while millions of women dreamed of her image, Veronica Lake herself was a hostage to a diagnosis that Paramount Studios guarded more carefully than state secrets. Schizophrenia had been diagnosed in her childhood, but to the movie moguls, madness was merely an inconvenient technical flaw, something that could be contained with a strict contract and a thick layer of makeup. Veronica became the living embodiment of toxic success. On screen, she radiated magnetism. Off camera, she turned into someone whose presence was physically unbearable. They called her Mean Veronica, and it was no exaggeration. Colleagues remembered her as cold, aggressive, and utterly unpredictable. She could shut down a shoot simply because she disliked the color of the set walls, or fly into a rage that escalated into physical violence for no apparent reason. Frederick March, her co-star in I Married a Witch, once snapped in frustration, delivering a line that became the epitaph of her reputation. Life is too short to spend it with Veronica Lake. But Hollywood did not care about her inner hell as long as the box office kept ringing. Her illness was written off as a bad temper, alcoholism, or star syndrome, while the truth that a mind was slowly disintegrating behind the tantrums was deliberately ignored. The most terrifying chapter began when public interest in her image started to fade. The moment the peekaboo fell out of fashion, Veronica Lake stopped being an asset and became dead weight. She was dropped by the studio, and yesterday's goddess instantly found herself on the margins of life. Without professional handlers and studio control, her schizophrenia, fueled by cheap alcohol, blossomed unchecked. Veronica rapidly lost her grip on reality. She went through 3 failed marriages, lost custody of her children, and eventually ended up in New York, destitute. The finale of the golden icon is one of the bleakest examples of Hollywood oblivion. In the early 1960s, a reporter stumbled upon her working as a waitress in a cheap bar at the Martha Washington Hotel. She lived in a tiny room where the only luxury left was memory, serving customers who had no idea that the woman pouring their coffee was once the object of the world's obsession. Lake tried to present it as a conscious choice, a desire to be closer to people, but her extinguished gaze and trembling hands told a different story. She suffered from paranoia, convinced that intelligence agencies and old Hollywood enemies were watching her. By the age of 50, her body was completely ravaged by alcohol and untreated mental illness. Veronica Lake died in 1973 from liver cirrhosis and kidney failure, forgotten and abandoned. Her death caused no wave of national mourning, just a short obituary buried in the back pages of newspapers. But the most chilling part came after her cremation. Her ashes remained in a funeral home for years because no relatives were willing to claim them or pay for their storage. Eventually, the urn containing the remains of one of the most desired women on the planet ended up in an antique shop where it was discovered decades later among old furniture and dusty figurines. Veronica Lake became a symbol of how Hollywood uses illness as fuel for a screen image, and when that fuel runs out, discards the empty shell into the trash heap of history. She was the queen of noir, whose personal darkness was far denser than anything cinematographers ever created on set. Her hidden eye beneath that fringe was not just an erotic device, but a metaphor for her life. Half of her identity always remained in shadow, a place those who profited from her beauty were afraid to look.
Judy Garland. If you are looking for the clearest proof that Hollywood is a meat grinder fueled by children's tears, the story of Judy Garland is your ultimate exhibit. This is not merely the tale of a fallen star. It is a chronicle of systematic, years-long psychological and physical abuse inflicted on a child and sanctioned at the highest levels. Judy, born Frances Gumm, fell into the grip of MGM at just 13 years old, and from that moment on, she no longer belonged to herself. Studio chief Louis B. Mayer called her "my little hunchback" and routinely humiliated her over her appearance, drilling into the girl's mind that she was an ugly duckling beside the studio's flawless beauties like Lana Turner. But emotional cruelty was only the tip of the iceberg. To squeeze maximum productivity out of a young body, the studio put Judy on a pharmaceutical regimen that bordered on insanity. It was a monstrous carousel of drugs: amphetamines in the morning so she could work 18 hours without rest, appetite suppressants during the day so she would not gain a single ounce, and powerful barbiturates at night so she could instantly collapse into sleep for 4 hours before the next shooting day. By the time she slipped on her famous ruby slippers in The Wizard of Oz, her metabolism and psyche were already irreparably damaged. Imagine a 16-year-old girl whose brain is constantly saturated with heavy stimulants. It is no surprise that panic attacks, paranoia, and crushing depression became her lifelong companions. Hollywood did not see a human being in Judy Garland. It saw a cash cow, an asset meant to generate profit here and now, regardless of wear and tear. When she grew older, the situation only worsened. The fragile foundation of her personality, built on drugs and insecurity, began to crack. She made repeated attempts to end her life, but each time the studio covered up the scandal, bribed doctors, and dragged her back onto the set by force of contract and pressure. By 1950, MGM had completely drained its asset and terminated her contract, discarding a woman who, at 28, felt closer to 80. Left without the rigid control of studio handlers, Judy plunged into a true hell of mental illness. Her psyche resembled a patchwork quilt stitched together from fears and addictions. She was terrified of the stage, yet the stage was the only place where she felt alive. Her concerts in London and New York became legendary, but behind the curtain they were scenes not for the faint-hearted. Judy could break down in hysterics before going on, faint from exhaustion, or forget the lyrics to her own songs under the weight of medication. She married 5 times, yet no man could give her the unconditional love that had been stolen from her in childhood. Doctors assigned her diagnoses one after another: cyclothymia, acute anxiety disorder, nervous exhaustion. She was treated in the finest clinics in the world, but you cannot repair a building that was never given a foundation. In the final years of her life, Judy Garland became a living monument to human cruelty. She looked worn to the bone, her voice, once capable of moving mountains, trembling with unbearable inner pain. The public adored her, yet came to her performances as if to gladiator fights, subconsciously waiting for the moment she would finally collapse before their eyes. Her death in 1969 from an accidental overdose of barbiturates in the bathroom of her London apartment was tragic but grimly inevitable. She did not simply burn out, she was methodically burned by those who profited from her talent.
She never found her way home from her own nightmarish Emerald City, because in reality there was no kindly wizard, only greedy producers and a merciless industry that first drained her dry, then branded her insane and showed her the door. Judy Garland remains in history as the greatest martyr of the screen, a woman whose madness was entirely manufactured in Hollywood's laboratories. Her cry for help was disguised as magnificent song, but if you listen closely, in every note you can hear the clang of MGM's prison doors, which never once opened for her until the very end.
The Secret of Cary Grant. If you are looking for the embodiment of Hollywood elegance, impeccable manners, and effortless irony, the name Cary Grant rises to the surface first. He was the gold standard of the gentleman, the man every other man wanted to be and every woman wanted to have. Yet behind that porcelain mask of perfection ran a crack so deep it nearly split his identity in two. The Secret of Cary Grant is one of the darkest and most cynical stories of the Golden Age, a tale of how a lie can become the foundation of worldwide fame and at the same time a private hell. As a teenager in Bristol, England, Archibald Leach, his real name, came home one day to discover that his mother, Elsie, had simply vanished. His father, Elias, without blinking, told the boy that his mother had gone away to a seaside resort to rest her nerves, and soon afterward claimed she had died suddenly. Archibald grew up branded as an abandoned child, believing his mother was either dead or had chosen not to see him again. This betrayal shaped Cary Grant. He developed a panicked fear of intimacy, a deep mistrust of women, and spent his entire life trying to prove that he was worthy of love by constructing an immaculate screen persona. Only in 1935, when Grant was already a global star basking in fame, did his father confess the monstrous truth on his deathbed. Elsie had never died. He had simply committed her to a psychiatric asylum in Bristol so she would not interfere with his new life and another woman. Cary Grant's mother spent 21 years locked inside a mental institution, effectively buried alive by her own husband. Imagine the shock of realizing that his entire ascent to the Hollywood Olympus had been soaked in lies, while his mother had been wasting away behind padded walls. The revelation did not merely knock the ground from under his feet, it plunged him into a permanent existential crisis. He removed his mother from the institution and bought her a house, but the bond they had lost could not be repaired. Standing before him was a broken, exhausted stranger who no longer recognized the Hollywood idol as her Archibald. The fear of inherited madness and the awareness of how easily a person could be erased from reality turned Grant's life into a relentless search for selfhood. He went through 5 marriages, yet found peace in none of them, always expecting betrayal. This inner fracture eventually led him to the most radical experiment of his life. In the late 1950s, at the peak of his career, Grant became one of the earliest and most fervent advocates of LSD therapy. At the time, it was not yet a counterculture drug, but an experimental psychiatric treatment, and Grant underwent more than 100 supervised sessions under medical guidance. He genuinely believed that these acid trips would allow him to hack his own mind, strip away the persona of Cary Grant, which he had grown to despise, and rediscover the betrayed boy named Archibald. He openly declared in interviews, "I was reborn after LSD. I got rid of all my fears and complexes." From the outside, however, it looked like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Grant became obsessed with controlling his mind, spending hours in meditation and hallucinogenic exploration, attempting to purge the shadow of that asylum that followed him everywhere. To others, this seemed like an eccentricity of a wealthy star.
In reality, it was a quiet cry for help from a man whose entire world rested on the shifting sands of family deceit. Grant was so deeply traumatized that he forbade his daughter to read any biographies about him, terrified that she might see behind the gentleman's facade the broken boy from Bristol. He walked away from cinema at the height of his fame simply because he could no longer carry the weight of someone else's name and someone else's destiny. The secret of Cary Grant is the story of how even Hollywood's most dazzling smiles can be a defense mechanism against childhood terror. He proved that it is possible to deceive the entire world into believing in your perfection, but impossible to deceive your own genes or the memory of locked doors in a mental ward. His life was a grand performance, whose final act unfolded in the shadow of hallucinogens and an endless attempt to forgive a traitorous father. Cary Grant remains in history as a style icon, yet inside he always remained that Archibald who woke each morning to check whether the walls of his reality were still standing and whether his luxurious mansion had not quietly turned into yet another room for those who knew too much about Hollywood's darkness.
Natalie Wood. If Hollywood had an award for the most traumatizing childhood under the care of a devoted mother, Natalie Wood would undoubtedly share the podium with Judy Garland. Natalie's story is not merely the biography of a screen goddess, it is a clinical case of how parental obsession can turn a child's life into a prolonged nervous breakdown lasting 43 years. It all began with her mother, Maria Zakharenko, a woman with the habits of a dictator and a fanatical belief in dark prophecies. Maria convinced little Natalie that she was destined to become a great star while simultaneously drilling into her a superstitious terror: beware of dark water. A fortune-teller's warning became the core of Natalie's identity, growing into a full-blown phobia that Hollywood would later exploit with cold calculation to extract the right emotions on screen. When Natalie was only 9 years old, an incident occurred on the set of The Green Promise that permanently cracked her psyche. Her mother, determined to wring maximum realism from her daughter, insisted that the child walk across a rickety bridge over a raging stream. The bridge collapsed. Natalie nearly drowned and suffered a severe fracture of her wrist. And here the true nature of Hollywood's backstage cruelty revealed itself. Maria Zakharenko forbade anyone to take her daughter to the hospital, fearing that a cast would give the studio grounds to cancel the contract. The child was forced to continue filming through the pain. The bone healed incorrectly, leaving a visible lump. That deformity became a lifelong symbol of Natalie's helplessness and her constant fear of her mother. For the rest of her life, she wore heavy bracelets on her left wrist to hide that mark of betrayal. By the mid-1960s, when Natalie was at the peak of her fame after West Side Story and Splendor in the Grass, her emotional state resembled a powder keg. On the surface, she embodied Hollywood elegance. Behind closed doors, her life consisted of endless visits to psychoanalysts, panic attacks, and long, crushing depressions. Natalie Wood was a textbook victim of post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition no one treated, preferring to label it the temperament of an actress. She was terrified of loneliness and darkness. Her relationships with men, including 2 marriages to Robert Wagner, were steeped in emotional instability and a desperate search for the protection she had been denied as a child. In 1966, her emotional state finally buckled. Natalie made a suicide attempt by overdosing on sleeping pills. The Hollywood machine swiftly buried the incident, presenting it as an accidental overdose, but to those close to her, the truth was obvious. The queen of drama could no longer carry the weight of her childhood nightmares. She became a hostage to her own image and to her mother's expectations, which continued to control her life even after Natalie herself became a mother. Her inner demons found an outlet in endless psychotherapy sessions on which she spent staggering sums trying to buy her mind back from the past. She admitted to friends that she felt like an imposter in her own life and that the water she feared would one day come for her. Her emotional instability was fueled by alcohol and sleeping pills, a volatile mix combined with deep-seated anxiety. The final years of Natalie Wood's life were marked by desperate attempts to find peace, but in an industry where every step is judged through box office numbers, peace was a luxury she could not afford. Her death in November 1981 near San Catalina Island became the tragic embodiment of her greatest fear. Regardless of exactly what happened aboard the yacht Splendor that night, the simple fact that a woman who was terrified of water ended up alone in the ocean after dark speaks volumes about the level of psychological chaos in her life. Natalie's mind had been unsteady long before she went overboard. She had been drowning in a sea of Hollywood ambition and maternal curses since the age of 10. She is remembered as the actress with the saddest eyes in cinema history, the eyes of a child who never waited in vain for someone to take her to a doctor and save her from the dark water raging inside her own mind. Her story is a bleak reminder that success built on childhood trauma never brings happiness. It only creates a golden cage where the only escape can seem like a leap into the abyss you feared more than anything else in the world.
Rita Hayworth. If there was ever a figure in classic Hollywood who embodied absolute, overwhelming femininity, it was Rita Hayworth. Yet behind the fiery cascade of hair and the legendary dance in Gilda lay the tragedy of a woman who was shaped, controlled, and ultimately betrayed in a deeply damaging way. Rita's fate reads like a clinical case study of how the dream factory can dismantle a human being piece by piece, leaving almost nothing of the original self. It began with a profoundly unhealthy foundation. As a teenager, Margarita Cancino, her real name, grew up under the oppressive control of her father, Eduardo Cancino. He did not see his daughter as a child in need of protection, but as an extension of his own ambitions, forcing her to exhausting performances with him in nightclubs and denying her any sense of safety or personal boundaries. This early emotional and psychological violation left lasting scars. Rita carried a deep, lifelong trauma. She remained painfully shy, deeply insecure, a woman who feared intimacy yet desperately sought approval and affection. When she arrived in Hollywood, the executives at Columbia Pictures decided that her Spanish heritage was a liability. What followed was a brutal transformation. To make the actress appear more acceptable, Rita was subjected to years of painful electrolysis, burning away her natural hairline to reshape her face. Her hair was dyed red, her features altered, her body pushed to exhaustion through relentless demands to lose weight. Hollywood reconstructed Rita Hayworth out of a living person, leaving behind a carefully polished image meant to function as a screen fantasy. It is no surprise that her inner world began to fracture. She married 5 times, including unions with the brilliant Orson Welles and Prince Ali Khan, and each ended in disappointment and collapse. Rita often repeated a bitter observation that summed up her life. Men go to bed with Gilda, and they wake up with me. No one wanted the real woman with her fears and vulnerabilities. Everyone wanted only the illusion. By the 1960s, her condition became impossible to ignore. She began forgetting lines, growing irritable on set, and suffering alarming memory gaps. And here Hollywood revealed its deepest cynicism. Instead of offering help, the press and even colleagues branded her a hopeless alcoholic. Every mistake, every moment of confusion was attributed to drinking. The public consumed photographs of the once glorious goddess looking lost or unkempt, mocking the image of a fallen star. In reality, Rita Hayworth became one of the first widely visible victims of Alzheimer's disease, a condition that was barely understood at the time. What was mistaken for intoxication was the gradual destruction of her cognitive abilities. She lost the capacity to recognize her own daughters, forgot who she was, and suffered panic attacks, unable to understand where she was or what was happening around her. In 1976, a particularly disturbing incident occurred. At Heathrow Airport, Rita was escorted off a plane in a state of severe confusion, and newspapers ran sensational headlines about a drunken outburst of a goddess. It was a moral execution of a woman who was seriously ill and in need of care, not ridicule. Only in 1980, when her daughter Yasmin assumed guardianship, did the world finally learn the truth about her diagnosis. Rita's final years were a quiet fading into emptiness. She lived in an apartment in New York, remembering neither her fame nor her husband's, nor the fact that her image had once been painted on an atomic bomb dropped on Bikini Atoll, another chilling irony of her fate. Hollywood first erased her heritage, then her identity, and finally her mind. Rita Hayworth died in 1987, becoming a symbol of how merciless the world can be to those who were too beautiful to be allowed to suffer openly. Her tragedy stands as the closing note in this gallery of broken stars, a reminder that the most terrifying prison is not a locked ward, but a mind slowly destroyed by an industry that never showed mercy to its own idols.
The 10 stories we have examined are not isolated cases of bad luck, but a systemic indictment of an industry that spent decades perfecting the art of turning living people into disposable props. We saw studio bosses acting like deranged surgeons, reshaping not only bodies but minds, stuffing their protégés with pills, scorching their thoughts with electroshock, locking them in cages the moment they showed any sign of human vulnerability. The tragedy of Marilyn, Vivien, Frances, and the others lies in the fact that they became hostages to their own perfection. The world denied them the right to weakness, illness, or aging. Hollywood of that era functioned like a colossal psychiatric ward without doctors, where therapy was replaced by new contracts and compassion by magnesium flashes. These people paid for our dreams with their sanity, dying in loneliness, poverty, or oblivion, while reels of their immortal smiles continued to spin on screens. Today, in the age of so-called new ethics, we like to believe we have grown more humane. Yet a glance at modern headlines makes one thing clear: the machine still demands sacrifices, only its methods have become more refined. Let these stories remind you that behind every great shot stands a real human being who may have been crying out for help at that very moment, only to have their voice drowned out by applause. Take care of your mind, don't be fooled by cheap glitter, and remember this: the highest price fame can demand is the simple ability to remain yourself. Our descent into the abyss ends here, but the shadows of old Hollywood still wander its dark sound stages, whispering a timeless warning that even gods go mad when they are forced to play a role forever in someone else's nightmare.